welcome to another essential lecture in Jewish history. Today's lecture is remarkably unpleasant and a lot of nasty stuff. We're going to talk about medieval anti-Semitism. A warning straight up, a lot of the images that I will need to use to illustrate the nature of medieval anti-Semitism are quite graphic and kind of painful to look at. So if you are under the age of 18, this might not be the right video for you to look at. There we go, fair warning. Okay, so the first thing we need to say about anti-Semitism is that it's bad. The second thing is that it can be broken down into four basic periods. One of the really unusual aspects of anti-Semitism as a human ideology is that it really adapts to the nature of the society in which it is finding its host. It adapts to its host like a virus, really. And you'll see that, anti-Semitism can find fertile soil in places where there are hardly any Jews, like Japan, for example, where there is a lot of fascination with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. We'll talk about that later. And it'll be radically different in nature than, let's say, the anti-Semitism of 12th century Germany. Very different kind of phenomenon. There are four basic periods. We're going to focus on the third, but let's quickly run through those four basic periods in which anti-Semitism shifted its ideology. The first period is known as that of ancient xenophobia. Xenophobia refers to the fear of strangers. And this is kind of like the period in which Jews suffered a certain amount of distress at the hands of Greeks and Romans and other ancient peoples. And a lot of the literatures from this period have, negative things to say about Jews. However, most of those statements really are in the category of normal cultural conflict between human societies that differ one from another. And it's not unlike the way, let's say, Chinese people may have an antipathy to Vietnamese, or Scandinavians of various stripes might dislike one another. It's normal for people not to like each other to a certain degree and to say nasty things about each other behind their backs and in print. And so, to a large degree, much of the antipathy directed against Jews in the ancient period was related to misunderstandings of basic Jewish practice. For example, the maintenance of a separate diet through kosher laws, circumcision rituals, and so on. But let's look at one image here just to give you a sense of this. This is, of course, the famous Arch of Titus, or Titus, that commemorated for the Romans the destruction of Judea and the temple and so on. And there's a very famous bas-relief. If you zoom in here and you have a look, on the inside there's actually this image that depicts Romans carrying the Jews off into slavery, and of course there's the menorah there, famously depicted the spoils being taken from Jerusalem. Now, many people misunderstand this as a piece of anti-Semitic iconography. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's certainly, a piece of war monumental architecture. It commemorates a Roman victory over the Jews, no matter how brutal it was and how much the Jews disliked it and how much the Romans may have reveled in their victory. But these kinds of war memorials are very typical for the ancient, medieval, and one might even say the modern world. There's nothing distinctly anti-Semitic about this, other than the fact that the Jews happen to be the victims in this particular image. So in other words, ancient xenophobia is mainly a normal kind of conflict between Jews and non-Jews, just like many human societies have conflicts. Now, anti-Semitism gets a special character, which is something that's specifically for Jews when we get to the early Christian period. And now we're talking about basically the late 1st century up until, let's say, the 9th century of the Common Era. And this is a little different, and I would like to spend more time with this, but I've already given a lecture on this where you can zip back and see that. The basic idea, though, is that now, since Christianity is kind of like a daughter religion to Judaism, it's kind of like a breakaway minion that went viral and became a massively successful religion, there's a certain amount of tension that comes not from the normal intercourse or fissure between two peoples, but rather the kind of birth pangs of a new religion out of the old. And there will be tensions between the mother and the daughter, so to speak, of those two religions. So early Christian anti-Judaism is basically represented as a kind of a theological dispute, a dispute between a rabbi and a priest over what is the correct way to worship God. It certainly does not have the same kind of violent character that will appear in the Middle Ages, although there are exceptions to that rule. There are some really nasty things stated by St. John Chrysostom, for example, and others. But if you look at these images here, in the center you have a classic rendition of this way of thinking. None of these images date from the earliest periods, but they are, most of them come hundreds of years later, but they really illustrate these attitudes. We don't have much in the way of artwork depicting it earlier. These are the Ecclesia et Synagoga sculptures or paintings or stained glass windows, which represent the church versus the synagogue. On the left is always the church, and she has an upright staff. She's crowned. She's got a straight posture, and so on. And on the right is representation of the synagogue, falling away from the rock in an posture of decline, a broken staff, sometimes holding the tablets of the law upside down, meaning she's losing even her Judaism. And of course, she's usually blindfolded, meaning she can't perceive the truth of Christianity. So this is kind of like more specifically directed at Jews. It wouldn't make sense if this was, let's say, Japanese and Koreans. It has to be Christians and Jews specifically. And it repeats itself literally hundreds of times throughout Europe. Here's another example, a little bit more crude. You can see the crown falling off the head of the synagogue. And this one here, a little more interesting, I think, but the blindfold is really very clearly depicted there. And she's holding the tablets of the law upright. And here's a really nasty one, 14th century German stained glass window. And on the left, you see a church doing really well, the upright staff, riding a tetramorph, a mythic beast, and a hand comes down from heaven and crowns the church, indicating pretty obvious signal of divine approval. But on the right, synagogue not doing so well, riding some kind of donkey or mule, obviously not with the same connotations of Jesus riding a donkey, holding on to the severed ram's head, which refers to the sacrificial law. The crown is being knocked off the head, the blindfold, the broken staff, and in case you missed the point here, there is a sword descending from heaven into the top of the skull of synagogue. Once again, a very clear signal of divine disapproval. So this is kind of like a little more violent representation of it. It overlaps with the medieval period because it comes from the 14th century, but the notion is that it's still essentially a theological dispute at its core. Things change a lot in the medieval period, and we're going to talk a lot more about this, so I'm going to skip past it. And just to catch you up with where we are right now, modern anti-Semitism, which really dates from the 19th century onward. That's why, by the way, the term anti-Semitism was coined. In the 19th century, the term that was au courant in Germany was Judenfeinde or Judenhass, which meant Jew hatred. It was kind of like a rude term, a vulgar term. So Wilhelm Marr, a writer in the 1880s, coined this term Antisemitismus, which means I'm not a Jew hater. I hate the Semitic philosophy, by which he means obviously Jewish philosophy, whatever that is, and that's where we get the term anti-Semitism. It's more appropriately spelled without a hyphen because there is no such thing as Semitism that one can be anti. At any rate, here's a couple of representations of modern anti-Semitic thought, which basically comprises two main themes, none of which is religious. One of the big shifts with the modern period is that religion is kind of shunted aside. It's no longer relevant to the same degree it was in the medieval or the early Christian era. And now anti-Semitism is a secular phenomenon and also a much more dangerous phenomenon. As anti-Semitism leaves behind its religious roots, the violent correlation is inescapable. Anyways, here we go. This is a Nazi representation of the Jewish peril, and you can see the idea here of the Jew as a kind of a ugly tarantula creature, and you can see the disfigured physiognomy, which is typical of racist representations of Jews. They always have the heavy nose and the jowls and things like that. And the tarantula with its web reaching all over the globe is indicative of the theory of conspiracy theory, right? Here's an interesting example from Saudi Arabia with an octopus, again, the tentacles reaching out everywhere, controlling media, finance, stuff like that. Here's a 1977 British edition, and you can see once again the snake image, right? Because the snake reaches out over everything, encompasses the globe. In case the heavy nose and jowls and yarmulke were not enough to tip you off, the snake has the Stars of David all the way around, so you can tell, well, this is in fact a Jewish snake that's represented here. And here's one of my favorites. This is a great one. Mexico, 1930. The invisible world government, the Jewish program to subjugate the globe. And you can see the heavy kind of capitalist representation of a Jew with the big nose and the jowls, the yarmulke, the watch fob with little dollar sign, and of course he's with his claw-like hands, he's squeezing the world. I don't have like a world around here to squeeze, but that you get the idea, right? So that's modern anti-Semitism. Now we have to get back to the nastiness of medieval anti-Semitism. And there are four basic elements that are especially pronounced in the medieval period, by which I mean, by the way, for this context, really the High Middle Ages till about 1700. That's kind of not the standard definition of Middle Ages for other purposes, but in terms of the history of anti-Semitism, this is basically when it works. In the 12th century, you get the development of this idea of ritual murder. It had some antecedents, but the basic idea is that a child is somehow lured by a Jew for nefarious purposes. This is a theme, the alleged pedophilia that will penetrate very deeply into the Nazi period. And then that child is then set up for some kind of mock crucifixion and killed in the process. Again, let me reiterate that these things did not happen. I mean, Jews did, God forbid, never did anything like this. There were, however, occasions where children, like, today, God forbid, we have such terrible things where children are occasionally kidnapped and murdered. God forbid, it should not happen to any of us. But it is and people want a solution. They want some kind of reason. They want to know, how could such horrible thing happen? And the Jews were often a scapegoat where they were accused of doing these things. And the Jewish communities throughout Europe suffered greatly as a result of these false charges. Now, why would Jews want to do this? Well, the idea was, if the Jews were originally responsible for the death of Jesus, which is also not true. Please have a look at my lecture on Judaism, the Origins of Christianity, where I discuss the charge of deicide in a little more detail. Then perhaps they want to do it again, vicariously. And what better victim to represent Jesus than an innocent child? So the argument goes, and anti-Semitism has kind of like a bizarre but internal logic that allows it to somehow hold together and make sense to its practitioners. Jews wanted to reenact the crucifixion, the passion, through this act of ritual murder. It then devolves into an even nastier form of charge against the Jews. Once again, a totally false charge known as the blood libel, or in Hebrew, alilat dam. And the argument in the blood libel is that not only do the Jews want to re-crucify an innocent victim like Jesus was crucified, they also want to take his blood for all kinds of crazy reasons. There was this argument that Jews had an unusual odor, and the only deodorant that would take care of it was Christian blood. The blood was used as a kind of what's that word again? When you make people love you. Why do I forget that word? Well, hopefully, I like to do these things in one take, for some reason. Aphrodisiac. There you go, aphrodisiac. I knew I would get it. The blood was an aphrodisiac. It was assisting in, pregnancies, things like that. There was even an argument that Jewish men menstruated, and since this was the age before the iron pills, they had to take this blood to replenish their lost iron. Pretty bizarre things. But anyway, here's the representation of the murder of Simon of Trent. You can see there's a young Christian child here, and he's being surrounded by Jews. You can tell they're Jews because they have the little round ruel on their clothing, which was a mark that Jews were required to wear in many parts of Europe after 1215. And they're torturing him. They're trying to put in the same wounds that Jesus suffered in his side and so on, and they're also performing a circumcision and collecting the blood, which they will then use. Oh, of course, obviously, I forgot, there was arguments that Jews used the blood for the Passover matzah or for the wine used at the Passover Seder. Note also that Passover always occurs around the time of Easter, which is the Christian celebration of the crucifixion of Jesus, and so therefore all these things come together seasonally, and there's typically the same kind of violence against Jews following these kinds of charges throughout much of the Middle Ages. You can see on the left there is a woman there, and she's bringing in all kinds of torture devices and so on to help out with this. Very nasty. But it gets worse. One of the major ideas that was circulating in the Christian world in the 13th century onward was the notion of communion and the idea of the host, which is essentially a wafer. In the Orthodox Church, it's like a cube of bread, and it represented the body of Jesus, which I'm certainly no expert in these things, but Christians would go through the confession rituals and so on, and then they would be able to take communion, which involved the consumption of this wafer, which represented the body of Jesus. So the argument went, if the wafer was actually the body of Jesus, and you want to say, here's the strange logic of anti-Semitism, that Jews want to, crucify Jesus and torture him, then doesn't it also make sense that Jews would also want to torture the host as well? That's what this wafer was called. So we have all kinds of crazy stories circulating after the 13th century that Jews were engaged in this. And by the way, of course, the fact that these stories circulated only served to support the argument that the wafer was in fact the body of Jesus, because if it wasn't, why would the Jews allegedly want to torture it? Here's an example of some Jews with a very large wafer that they're poking with these kind of sharp things, and it's bleeding. Here is one of my personal favorites. I mean, and it's kind of bizarre that I have these things as favorites. It shows what I do with my spare time. But this is, I believe, from the German town of Posen, and it's a broadsheet that actually shows, in a cartoon fashion, step by step, how a charge of host desecration would arise. Let's look at it a little closely. So starting on the left, there's a Christian who's gone into a church, and he is stealing the wafers. You can see he's scooping them up into his bag. He then, in the second panel, brings them to the Jews. You can see the ruel on their clothes, indicating that they are Jews, and he offers the wafers, which they then exchange for money. They take it to their synagogue, and on the right-hand panel, you can see they torture it, and miraculously the host bleeds. You can see the 10 tablets up, the 10 commandments there in the artist's imagination of what Hebrew letters look like. However, the police, sensing something is wrong, come to the door in the left panel here, while the Jews try to get rid of the evidence, which they do in the second panel by throwing it into the furnace. Amazingly, looking into the furnace, they see the image of a small child, and doves fly out, which are caught by angels, all representations of the miracles associated with the host. Then the angered Christians break in, they arrest the Jews, and on the right panel, some of them are beheaded. You can notice that the Jew on his knee there is wearing the Judenhut, also a mandated article of clothing in many areas of medieval Europe. It later evolved into the witch's cap and the dunce cap, but it was associated originally with Jews. And then finally, on the left, you see there's horrible tortures taking place of the Jews, and they're set on fire. And then in the third panel, the Christian himself is taken off, tortured and punished. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that the synagogue is rededicated as a church. So that's kind of like how these blood libels and host desecrations would work. Again, please understand, this is a video, and I don't want you to walk away with the wrong message. Jews did not do these crazy things, but they were often charged with it falsely and violence was frequently the end result. Here's one last image of the host desecration. This is one of my favorites. There's a brilliant book by Nina Rubin on this topic, and she uses this illustration there. You can see the father here, the aged patriarch. He's torturing the host. It's bleeding there. The mother is saying "Oy vey's mir," like, because she's shocked because her rather adult-looking son, kind of a creepy picture, for lots of reasons, but the adult-looking son is saying, "Mommy, mommy, my brother, whom your father threw in the cauldron for suggesting he wanted to become a Christian, has now rising up out of the cauldron like that." And that's also part of a cycle of stories that was prevalent in the medieval period. Very nasty stuff. But wait, it gets worse. Finally, one of the last representations of medieval anti-Semitism is the so-called Judensau. Fascinating and totally grotesque idea. It means literally the Jewish pig. And it is a bizarre evolution or devolution of a judicial device that was employed in certain parts of Germany to punish minor offenders with caricatures drawn of them. And they were often, and these caricatures would be drawn and posted, and that was kind of like a punishment for various minor crimes. They were often drawn in these caricatures as consorting with pigs in one way or another, and they were often labeled as Jews as a kind of a mocking device. And later, as that judicial device went into disuse, the whole idea of the association between Jews and pigs nevertheless maintained its status. So here's, for example, an image, and it has many of the common elements in the Judensau. You can see that there are 4 Jews involved in various activities. Once again, right in the center of the backs of the 2 middle Jews, you see the Ruel, the Jewish badge, and the figures on the outside. You can see the Judenhut, and they're inspecting the anuses of the cow, the sow, and drinking its milk and so on. Here in this image, which is more typical, you see the elements of the devil being involved. You see on the right-hand side the devil with his horns, also wearing the ruel, is actively assisting Jews in eating the excrement from the pig. You see there's a woman in the background, and she's also holding a ram's head, which we saw in a different image earlier for similar reasons, though. And on the top, there's a victim of the blood libel. Here's one more image from Frankfurt. Same kind of thing. You see the themes reiterated over and over again with minor variations based on artistic license. So if we take this all as a whole, I think the most important message about this third period of anti-Semitism, I really should have said earlier, is that it goes from, starting with the first level, you have the xenophobia, which can be expressed in violence. I mean, I'm not diminishing the violence, just the nature of the ideology behind the activity is basically a natural human conflict, no matter how severe it may erupt into violence or warfare. And then it goes into specifically a dispute between the daughter religion of Christianity and the mother religion of Judaism, which can express itself with violence, but for the most part it's basically a theological argument. And then when you get to the 12th century, suddenly anti-Semitism goes off the rails, and it becomes really pathological with lots of bizarre things like that Jews need to drink blood and kill children, and none of this was present in the early Christian anti-Judaism. When we get to the modern period, specifically the 19th century and onward, people stop believing these kinds of crazy things, but they still want to have an antipathy to Jews, so they have to justify it in a different way. They do that primarily through racism and conspiracy theories. We will unfortunately have to talk about that in another lecture later on. But for the time being, I'm sorry that I had to expose you to these kinds of images. I hope that you found them enlightening, and hopefully we can keep all of this stuff clearly in the history of humanity and not have to deal with it in the future. Thank you for watching.